Hey everybody, and welcome to or back to the channel with Anthony and Bob Barker for another build. So this time we're going to be making a cabinet door, and this is part of a larger project, but this one was kind of detailed enough where I just felt like it kind of warranted its own video. That way I can actually go into the specifics of it. So here we are getting started, and my whole thought behind this is I wanted to have a shaker style-ish door that had a center that wasn't a complete solid panel. It's actually going to be part of a larger cabinet that's going to be holding my PlayStation, and so I was hoping that the video signal will be able to go through it. So for that, I had an idea in mind, and that's what we're getting started on here by getting the wood ready for that center panel of the cabinet door. And here you'll notice, if you've been watching my videos, I got a new toy. And believe it or not, this jointer, my wife is the one who convinced me to buy it. I was ready to get a much smaller one, and she made me realize that a bigger, in this case, was probably better. And the reason why we're going for the center panel first is, to be honest, I wasn't quite sure exactly how I was going to put this thing together because of the shape this center panel will take. And also I didn't really know the full size of everything, so I figured for me it was just easier to get my mind wrapped around it once I got that center panel kind of roughly made. So we got our pieces of maple flattened, then planed down to about 1/2 inch, and now I brought them back to the joiner to get these edges ready for glue up, just to make the full panel. And you can see my dust collection was not quite keeping up with that. It probably didn't help that my filter was clogged, but that's another thing I'm going to have to deal with in my shop pretty soon. So for the glue up, we're using my panel clamps. I really do like these things because I tend to make a lot of panels, and they have really helped kind of streamline the process for me. These ones are the bigger version, so it doesn't quite work as well on this 1/2 inch material, but I just got some extra pieces of plywood with some painter's tape underneath, and it clamped together just fine. So once we got that out of the clamps, we can get it down to the size that we need it. That way we can actually get started on the design. So for this, I am using this upcut bit. And the reason why I went with an upcut bit on this one is I want those kind of grooves on the inner portion to be as clean as possible. It will make the outside edges a little ratty, but that's much easier to clean up than the inside edges. So what we're doing here is I'm going to be doing this all just in a grid pattern. I set my fence and I run it along and then turn it 90 degrees, do another cut, and do that 4 times for each distance from the fence. And what I found that it was easier on this particular type of one to do it in 2 passes instead of full depth on the one cut, and it came out much better with less tear out that way. This is actually the second piece, because the first piece I did, I got halfway through and my wife really liked the pattern, so she had me save that piece for potential future use, and then I did another one for the actual project. Now, you don't have to do it in this particular way. You can just attach a piece of wood as a guide, kind of like when you're doing finger joints down to the router table surface. But for me, personally, I just like the security of my router fence there, because I know it's not moving. I just felt much more secure in my cuts. Now, as I mentioned before, there is tear out when you do this to some degree. So what I would do is I would just put a little bit of CA glue in there, an accelerator, and just kind of hold it in with my chisel, although I probably should just use a screwdriver or something. But you can see here that it cleans that up pretty nicely. And so we just keep on going, and once you're done with this, you just create a grid of squares. And then what we're going to end up doing is we're going to create the same grid, just offset on the other side, so it looks like a bunch of squares on squares. And then you can see how bowed this thing is here. What happened was I did the bottom side on one day, and then I didn't have any time to finish it, so I left it out. And when I came back, it just looked like a banana. So I had to wrestle with this a whole bunch as I was doing the other side, but it ended up working out okay. And then you can see here, it was really satisfying doing the other side, as you see that grid of squares finally start to take shape. And the more I did it, the more it started to flatten out. And by the time I was done, it still had a bit of banana shape. However, when I laid it out and came back the next day, it ended up being completely flat. So that really made me feel much better, because I spent a long time making this and I didn't want to have to do a third one. And I also want to mention the reason why I went with this particular one is my original thought was to do like a metal kind of grate in the middle of just of a shaker door. But all the ones I liked cost like $500 a sheet, and for something that I might not ever use again, I just couldn't really justify the cost. So that's why I kind of went with this particular design. I hadn't seen another door with this design in it, but I saw like a small little coaster of it somewhere online, and I just thought it would be a good idea. So I ended up doing a lot of hand sanding and a little bit of chisel work, and I ended up finding out that the chisel actually cleaned it up better than the sanding did. So I kind of abandoned the sanding idea after I just did like a little pass on just the edges of it. But it was a little bit tedious to get all of those edges as clean as I wanted to be. So when I finally get that done, now it's time to decide on how we're going to make this shaker door. And you can see the two patterns here. I wasn't sure how I was going to inset them, and I leaned towards the one on the left and not the right because I don't want those squares to be cut off by the door itself. So now that I have that decided, I can figure out how I'm actually going to make this door. And because the layout that I decided on, I can't actually make a true shaker style door with the groove in the center of it. The reason being is the piece, the center section is about a 1/2 inch thick, and the way it would sit in there with a shaker style door is that it would push the front of that middle panel flush with the front of the door. And I definitely wanted that to be inset. So now we're going to cut up our wood and get these all together. And the other thing that I needed to decide is how thick these pieces were going to be, because I wanted it to be full squares and not cut off in the middle of any of them. So that did change the sizing. So we're putting this together almost like just a flat picture frame type thing, with butt joints. And I'm using the domino here because it's fast and easy. You can do this with dowels or other ways as well. But one thing that I did not consider was how I'm going to deal with finger pulls, and that really should have changed my placement of these dominoes, which will come back to bite me in the butt a little bit later. Meantime, blissfully unaware, I go to my glue up and I just put a little painter tape in the corners because it really helps with the glue squeeze out to clean that up, because I really do not like trying to get that sanded off in those corners because it's just a pain. And what I ended up doing to make my dimensions work is I made the stiles thicker than the rails. And I've done this before on like doors and other stuff, and I feel like that just works out much better than doing the sides or the stiles thinner, because then it just kind of looks funny. So once I have that all together, we're just doing a really small round over. This is just a 1/16 inch round over bit on all of the edges, top and bottom. And then I can start working on the rabbet, which is going to hold that middle panel. And on this one, I did this in a few passes. I just wanted to be very slow and methodical and make sure I just worked my way up to the right depth. And it's always better practice to kind of do little bits at a time. That way you don't get as much like blowout or anything like that. And then after this, I added a little extra work for myself, because when you route this in this way, the edges become rounded. So you either want your panel's edges to be round, or you want to square off these afterwards with a chisel. Now, I ended up doing that, and then halfway through the first one, I realized my edges really didn't need it, and I could have just left it as is. But sometimes that's just how it goes. So I got to work on doing that, and while I was doing that, I got an urgent text from the supervisor, and when the supervisor calls, you answer. Turns out he just wanted to show off his new vacation wear. So after assuring the big boss lady that the supervisor looked adorable in his new outfit, I got back to work on this chiseling. And you do see that I used these scrap pieces that I glued together at 9° as a guide, just to make it nice clean edges on these corners. And so now I'm going to be using this bit right here to create the finger pull, because I didn't want to have any actual hardware on this. Now, normally I would do this probably on the side of the door, but because of the overall project and the layout of it, it ended up working out better to put this on the very top. And I did multiple test pieces with this, and I found that it's better just to do it all in one go and don't do like little portions at a time, because I just got so much blowout doing it that way. But here is where that domino placement bit me in the butt. And to be honest, when I placed the dominoes, I didn't know which side I was going to put this groove on. But I ended up doing it on the top, and it bit right into just the very edge of those dominoes, which in the end, I guess, isn't the worst thing, because it's in that groove there, so you can't ever really see it. But now that I have that piece all ready, I can actually get my center panel here cut to the right size. So I am cutting just those top little squares off and leaving the bottom / inset squares in place, because that's what's going to sit against that rabbited joint in the cabinet door. And this was kind of nerve-wracking because I spent so much time making this and cleaning it. I really didn't want anything to go wrong, and luckily nothing did. It went right nice and smooth. And then here was my first test fit with it, and I was ecstatic at this point because it's coming out exactly how I was hoping it would. Well, at least aesthetically, because functionally, I'm actually not even sure yet if it's gonna work, because I haven't installed the final project and put the PlayStation in there and tested it out yet. I'll probably put a pinned comment below once I actually do that and let you guys know if it actually worked for its intended purpose. So after that's done, now we can get to the finishing details here. We're just using the Craig jig here to get the cutout for the hardware in place. And then here is another part where I just tortured myself. When I was about to do this, I realized I really should do like a spray-on finish. But since I was already doing this Rubio Pure on everything else on this project, I figured like I could just bite the bullet and do it. And it was a terrible, terrible idea. Getting it into all those nooks and crannies and then wiping it all off was a bit more tedious than I bargained for. But it eventually got done, and then I can move on to the door frame. Now for walnut, I do 2 coats of the Rubio monocoat. You probably can't notice it so well on the video or even in pictures, but it looks decent with 1 coat. But if you use that maroon pad to knock it all down and then rub in a 2nd coat, it just gets a lot more rich and smoother, and it just looks significantly nicer. So if you haven't tried it before with working with walnut, I definitely do recommend trying that 2nd coat. And then in these corners, you can kind of see the exposed dominoes right there. And like I said, you'll never notice that once it's actually installed on the final product. And so now we're in the home stretch. We're just getting our final hardware in place. So for the hinges, I'm just using these regular Blum concealed European style hinges. And that'll kind of be nice and out of the way and keep the outside aesthetic looking good because I don't want any real visible hardware. And then for here, you can see we flip that down and put it inside, and then the back end sits nice and flush with the frame. And I use these little clips that I think they normally use for like glass doors. And then I just use this owl to mark out the little squares where I want them to stay. And I'm only doing 4 of them on this one. I found out once I got those in that it just held it really nicely. I don't think it's necessary to add any more. And what I did do also, I should mention on this center panel, is I left just a small gap on all of the sides there for the final sizing of it, just to account for any wood movement so it doesn't kind of bow or crack or break those squares, because that would really sadden me if that happened later. And that gets to the end of this part of the project. Now, if you're curious to see the final project, that'll be out in my next video, so keep an eye out for that, and we'll have a full build going for that, and we'll probably end up making some build plans for the final project, and I'll include even extra details of how to make this. So that's going to be it for this one. Let me know what you think about it below, and if you like what we're doing, feel free to hit that like or subscribe. It really does help us out. Otherwise, we'll see you guys in the next one.